We often hear about the powerful men of the empire, but what about the women who lived in its shadow? Today, we're diving into the little-known world of female concubines in the Roman Empire. From pleasure dolls to marriage partners, these women played a complex and often controversial role in Roman society. The word concubine conjures up all sorts of romanticized and sometimes lurid images, but the reality was often much more complex. Concubines were not simply mistresses or sex slaves, but rather a type of unofficial spouse who held a unique and often ambiguous position in Roman society. Welcome to Greatest History. Today we'll be examining the role of concubines in Roman culture, how they were viewed by the wider society, and the ways in which they were able to wield influence and power. So, sit back, grab a cup of tea, and join us as we journey back in time to the fascinating world of the Roman concubine. Concubinage, or the practice of taking a concubine, has a long history in Rome. The origins of concubinage can be traced back to the early Roman Republic, when wealthy patrician families often kept a number of slave concubines. These concubines were often captured in war or purchased from slave markets, and they had very little legal protection or rights. They were considered property, and their primary function was to provide sexual pleasure and bear children for their masters. However, it's important to note that not all concubines in ancient Rome were slaves. Some concubines were pre-born women who entered into relationships with men for various reasons. For example, a freeborn woman might choose to become a concubine in order to gain financial security or social status. In these cases, the women would typically be given a set of legally binding contracts that outlines the terms of her relationship with her male partner. The role of concubines. As Rome grew and became more sophisticated, the role of concubines in Roman society also evolved. Concubines began to play a more important role in Roman society, and some were even able to gain a measure of social status and respectability. This was particularly true for those concubines who were able to bear children for their masters, as the children of concubines were often recognized as legitimate and were able to inherit their father's property. In some cases, concubines were even able to rise to positions of great influence and power. For example, the famous Roman empress, Livia, was the concubine of Emperor Augustus before eventually becoming his wife and one of the most powerful women in Roman history. Livia was able to use her position as the emperor's consort to wield significant political power and influence, and she's remembered as one of the most influential women in Roman history. Want to become the most influential fans in history? Subscribe to Greatest History. Now, back to it. It's important to note that the treatment of concubines varied greatly in ancient Rome. Some concubines were treated well and were able to rise to positions of power and influence, while others were treated poorly and were essentially used as pleasure dolls. The treatment of a concubine often depended on the wealth and status of her male partner, as well as the specific terms of her contract. The decline and abolition. The growing social acceptance of concubinage and the influential roles that some concubines were able to play in Roman society led to the practice eventually being abolished in the Roman Empire. The decline of the concubinage can be traced back to the reign of Emperor Constantine, who made significant changes to Roman law and introduced new moral codes that condemned the practice. Under Constantine's laws, concubines were no longer considered legal spouses, and their children were no longer recognized as legitimate. This meant that concubines were no longer able to inherit their master's property, and their status in Roman society declined significantly. The decline of concubinage was also influenced by the spread of Christianity in Rome, as the Christian Church strongly condemned the practice. Despite these legal and cultural changes, the practice of concubinage persisted in some form for many years. It was not until the end of the Roman Empire that the practice was finally abolished, and concubines were no longer able to gain any legal recognition or protection. The legacy. In spite of the eventual abolition of concubinage in Rome, the practice left a lasting legacy on the culture and history of the Roman Empire. The stories of powerful concubines like Livia have become an important part of Roman history, and their influence and impact on Roman society continue to be studied and debated by historians today. The role of concubines in Rome also serves as a reminder of the complex and often fluid nature of relationships and family structures in ancient societies. While the concept of a traditional family unit with a husband, wife, and children may be the norm in many modern societies, this was not always the case throughout history. The history of concubines in Rome demonstrates the ways in which relationships and family structures can change and evolve over time, and it serves as a reminder of the diversity of the human experience. The lives of concubines. While the role of concubines in ancient Rome varied greatly, their daily lives were often marked by a lack of autonomy and control. Concubines were essentially the property of their male partners, and they had very little agency or independence. They were often confined to their masters' households and were not allowed to leave without permission. Concubines were also often subjected to harsh treatment, especially if they were slaves. They were often beaten and mistreated, and they had no legal recourse if they were abused by their masters. However, some concubines were able to negotiate more favorable terms and were able to gain more autonomy and control over their lives. Nonetheless, even with these challenges, some concubines were able to carve out a measure of independence and agency within the constraints of their roles. For example, some concubines were able to use their positions to gain access to education and knowledge, which allowed them to gain power and influence within their households and beyond. The representation of concubines. In literature and art, concubines were often depicted as seductive and sexually voracious, with little depth or complexity. This stereotype was often used to justify the objectification and exploitation of concubines, and it helped to perpetuate negative attitudes toward them. However, it's important to note that this stereotype does not accurately reflect the lives and experiences of all concubines in ancient Rome. Some concubines were able to rise to positions of power and influence, and their lives were much more nuanced and complex than the stereotype suggests. It's also important to recognize that the lives of concubines were shaped by the specific historical and cultural context in which they lived, and it's not fair to judge them by modern standards. The history of female concubines in the Roman Empire is a complex and fascinating subject that offers insight into the changing social and cultural norms of the time. From their origins as slave concubines to their eventual decline and abolition in Roman society, concubines played a range of roles and were treated in a variety of ways. While the practice of concubinage was eventually abolished in Rome, it remains an important part of Roman history and serves as a reminder of the diversity and complexity of human relationships. The lives and experiences of concubines in ancient Rome were shaped by a range of factors, including the wealth and status of their male partners, the specific terms of their contracts, and the historical and cultural context in which they lived. It's also important to recognize that the representation of concubines in ancient Rome was often biased and stereotyped, and it's not fair to judge them by modern standards. In looking back to the history of female concubines in the Roman Empire, it's important to approach the subject with an open mind and a willingness to learn about the complexity and diversity of human experiences. Thank you for watching. Feel free to comment down below what you think and feel towards female concubines in the Roman Empire. We're eager to read your thoughts about it. Subscribe to be part of the Greatest Army and support the Greatest History channel. See you soon with much more of Greatest History.